Okay, so this is a mixing project. Usually I would have the mixer in another window, but for this video I'm trying to fit everything in one screen. I'm gonna briefly describe what we've got here, but very simple. We've got all the tracks here. Down here you can see the master track, and there's the automation to this epic reverb bus that's set up here, that we are sending reverb in this edit point at the beginning, towards the end of the track and at the end of the track. Down here we've got the mixer. Here we can see all the tracks, same track that we've got up here, and then the master and the bass that we mentioned. Those knobs here are not the panning knobs. I just got rid of them so we could better see, so we could better optimize the space in this window. Okay, so we aren't seeing the panning. We won't be talking much about automation. We may mention some specific things about it, but we'll be talking mostly about what plugins and what settings in those plugins we added in every track. And finally, here we can see the track that we've got selected with all the controls. So in case some of them are hidden here, we can see all the controls here and the track where the first one is routed to. This is the organization that I usually have when it comes to mixing. Usually I'll have the strings here, and above the strings I will have the pianos, celesta, harps, etc. Below the strings I will have the brass and woodwinds, and down below I'll have the percussion. If I've got synths, those will be right above percussion. So we'll start with the strings, and we'll see each track in the strings section, and then we'll go to the brass and the percussion, and finally we'll take a look at piano, celesta, and harp. So the stems that we've got here are the stems that made sense for me to export when I was composing, and it'll make sense to you as well. At the end of a track, you'll know which stems you should export. Maybe you don't need to export the high short brass because you don't have that much staccato brass, and maybe you could have just one stems for staccato brass. So for example, for the strings here, I'll have the strings long high, strings short high, but then I will separate the cello and some low strings, which will be basically the double basses, and at some point I will have the double basses and the cellos playing together. I separated the strings pizzicato because I needed to have some control over that. It's a section in the middle that needed some control over the pizzicato, and I wanted them separated from the staccatos. For brass, you'll see we don't even have short brass, long brass. We've got brass, and then which is long brass actually, and then we've got horns and trumpets. Those I separated them from the brass because they're featuring melodies, and we wanted to have control over those specific sections. We've got choir. We didn't have woodwinds really. We just have one flute that's playing at some point. So flute. Actually, the stem that I exported was long woodwinds, but in the mix I just renamed it to flute. Finally, we've got an electric bass, and then we've got high percussion, high, mid, and low percussion. I did two separate exports of high percussion because I needed to have control over the different parts of the high percussion, and I exported separately the Mark III because I wanted to give it some extra reverb, and usually I won't add that much reverb for the rest of the higher range percussion. So let's dive into it. Let's start with the strings, long, high. Okay, so first of all, we EQ'd the strings a little bit, gave it like 2 dBs at around 10K, and we got rid of 2 dBs, we cut 2 dBs at around 1.5, and finally we cut a little bit more at around 400. This is the API 550A from Waves. It's just adding a little bit of air, adding a little bit of treble, and getting rid of some of the annoying frequencies here at 1.5, and a little bit of math at around 400. It's very common EQ for high strings. You may find some slight variations, but it is common. As you can see, it's very, very subtle. Okay. Then we opened them a little bit. This is S1 from Waves, and basically what this does is makes the sound a bit wider, but as you can see, when you open this plugin, it is like this here at 1. We just moved it a little bit, like 1.3 or something like that. You don't have to go all the way up here, otherwise it won't sound natural. So opening the strings a little bit, and then we added a good amount of reverb. Those are the long strings. This is the dry signal, it's 100%, and then this is a dry signal at around 65% or something like that. It's a fairly long reverb. It is this preset called this Digital Hollywood Hall, which basically is a impulse response of a hardware digital reverb. So that's it for the strings long, high. Let's see for the short strings. In context. Again, same EQ, and this we've got cut at 300, not 400 this time. Just a tiny bit different, not a big difference. Let's. In this one, we can hear more of a difference, in part because we don't have the reverb afterwards, so that helps. It helps for us hearing the difference. Again, we opened them a little bit. We didn't compare first. Let's compare now in and out with the S1 plugin. It is subtle, but it is major difference. Let's make it bigger just for you to hear the difference. Right, so that's the effect. Now we wanna, the plugin starts here at 1, and you can make it narrower, but we went 1.2, 1.3. But you can hear the difference, especially in the sides and how it cleans a little bit the middle. And finally, we added a tiny bit of reverb. So this is a Berlin Church 2.2. Thing is, it doesn't sound that long, as it's 2.2. It's got less reverb, and it doesn't feel that long, really. So it's a matter of comparing with and without reverb. Okay, without. With. Just a tiny bit. So that's here's where we say use your ear, because if you look at here, 2.2, it's fairly long reverb, but the thing is, it doesn't feel that long when you add this reverb to shorter strings where we want to be subtle with reverb. Okay, again. Just a tiny bit. Without. With. Just a tiny bit of reverb there. Adding a little bit of room. Whereas with the high strings, with, it's a fairly long reverb. Without. With. Okay. Important here to see, back to the high strings, where when the melody comes in, I gave them quite a bit more of volume. Sometimes when you are mixing, you'll adjust balance, especially if you've been the composer. If you're mixing other composers' piece, then you are not sort of allowed to change the vision of the piece. But if it's your piece, then you may rethink the way you balanced it before. So you can see we've got good dynamics here, and the most dramatic ones will come here towards the end. We've got both here, volume going in and out, and also reverb. And you may say those strings aren't that high. That's right, but this is for the very last moment. I wanted a like mid-lower strings warm with a lot of reverb type of sound. And right here we don't have that many instruments, we don't have that many elements. We've got a piano and strings. That's piano and strings basically. So the less instruments, the less elements that you've got, the more reverb you can have. Now when you start having more and more elements, you gotta do some cleanup. It goes like this. Okay, just the strings basically and the piano last chord. So a lot of reverb, it's okay. As long as we cut some of the low end for the reverb, we are good to go. Cellos. Okay, let's see. We don't have that much here. Basically, we've got a little bit of EQ, sort of a similar cut. At this point, we've got a little bit of 2. We've got a little bit at 5K, and we're cutting a little bit at 0.8, so 800, and cutting a little bit more at around 200. Let's see the difference. See, it's not a big of a difference, but somehow it's a bit of a thinner sound, but not in a bad way. It'll help cleaning that low. It'll help gaining clarity in that mid-low area. So it's a thinner sound, but without losing the characteristics. And then we opened it a bit. As you can see, it's just very subtle. We've got the same setting for every strings stem. Low strings. Let's see this in context. So the reason why I wanted to have this in context is because I sometimes add a little bit of max bass to the lower instruments. I just see it's inserted here. I just felt that I didn't need it afterwards. So in this track, I basically just opened it a little bit. That's it. Obviously no reverb, and it didn't feel like it needed any EQ. Let's go to the pizzicato strings. They're here. In context. Okay, those ones do have a little bit of max bass, and I would have preferred having the double basses pizzicato, but not a big deal. They will just affect to any frequency that's below 128, 120, something like that. Actually, it's any frequency below 85. And basically, it'll add some artificial harmonics to the area where it feels lower. Let's actually see a comparison of that. Okay. So to give you an idea, just something very subtle to give it some extra bottom end. And that's at the end of the chain. What we've got here, it's opening the strings a little bit, again, same concept. Without. Okay, some more detail to the extreme left and right. And a tiny bit, believe it or not, of reverb. Same reverb that we've got before, it's a Berlin church. And you will say, well, it's the same reverb that we had before, and we didn't want to share reverbs or reverb settings. Yes, but the way it's been arranged, it's got a lot of separation. It's basically short notes with this high pedal note for the high string. A lot of separation. And the pizzicato strings are just in this moment. They won't appear anywhere else. Other than that, for the strings, we also wrote some automation, as we described in last module. For the longer strings, we've got fluctuation type of automation and also dynamics, enhancing dynamics, because we especially here. For the shorter strings, as we also saw in the last module, we've got a little bit of dynamics. Sometimes we'll go up and down, but most importantly, we will have that micro automation for helping the counterpoint in a way, or micro counterpoint. For the low strings, we've got a little bit of dynamics as well. And so for the pizzicatos, this one makes a bit of a difference. Let's listen with and without. Okay, this is this moment right here. We wanted to enhance that pa 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 pum. Right? So that's with and without. It's there, but it's not, it's got that little detail. See, it's all, we said when we are mixing, we want to bring some extra variation so the music feels alive, even more alive. Okay? And it's hundreds of subtle things that will make a difference when you put them all together. But it's not like one major thing which will make our music not sound natural. So again, with, without. It's missing that thing. And it's happening here again. Let's solo this. And going down here a bit or not, the idea is and going from more like mezzo piano to forte, but the thing is here sounds forte already, so and here it's we don't keep going up because already it sounds louder here. So we gotta use your ear. Without. With. Without. This last one, you can hear it, but with this little curve, it's more natural. The crescendo feels more natural. One more time. Okay? Well, for the cello, actually, we've got some dynamics here, some rebalancing here, so you can see. I think we've got something similar for the double basses. Here's a little bit of rebalancing. They were a bit too loud, so bringing them down. We've got a little bit of dynamics here and here as well. Let's see the cellos first. A little bit of dynamics here. Let's hear them. It's just very subtle here. You can see how we want more volume here and then it goes down here because of the music. It's like music comes in here, okay, let's bring some interest, cellos. But then there's more stuff going on. We've got the pedal, we've got the celesta, so let's bring them down. We already hear them, let's bring them down. They're still there, but let's leave some space for the rest of the instruments to sing. Rebalancing here, otherwise we wouldn't hear the cellos. No, read. We don't hear the cellos, and now we do. Okay, so rebalancing, bringing interest to the mix, and a little bit of dynamics for the double basses here. Let's hear them. Pum, pa pa pum. The dynamic goes there. Pa pa pum, pum, pa pa pum, pum, pa pa pum. That moment is where we. Okay, just enhancing them a little bit. They are not perfect. They were recorded with a DAW controller, so sometimes it's not perfect. Sometimes you'll grab the pencil tool and you'll tweak, and you'll fine-tune them, but sometimes they just sound good. So that's for the strings. Let's go to the brass. So horns. And I had a reverb loaded here, just didn't work. They came with enough reverb. It's just too much. It's not the reverb that they, when you stop the reverb, that the reverb tail, it's the reverb that they have from the recording itself, plus this reverb. When we play, it's too much. It's just, you can hear how it is too much. And actually, what you can hear it in context. It's more definition, it sounds more epic in a way without the reverb. And usually, the first thing I thought is let's add more reverb for these ones because I thought it was gonna work. It didn't. It's too much, they're too far. I could have maybe bring this down here and adding a tiny bit, but it just without reverb. So what we have here is we've showed this plugin before. This is the NLS Waves plugin. Just a tiny bit of analog flavor here. We've got 3 boards. This one seemed to work. So process here is just bringing a little bit of analog flavor and then bringing down the volume. So because as we saw last module, by bringing up that knob, we perceive it sounding louder. So I brought this down like a couple of dBs, so it stayed the same in the mix. And other than that, a little bit of automation, which is important actually towards the end with the high strings, but we actually worked harder on the high strings, you see here. And we didn't do that much here, the high strings and the horns, they play the different counterpoints here. Not counterpoints, but we've got a pa long note and then pa 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 pum. The staccato notes, they are the same. They're left, both left, and so again we've seen this a couple of times already, but it helps hearing the two musical elements. Okay. And here, horn usually would be an instrument where I would write quite a lot of dynamics. Didn't need them this time. The programming, the sequencing of them was good enough, felt natural enough. Sometimes you'll do things like this one, like this one here. A little bit of dynamics, extra dynamics here. This one, boom, cutting a little bit, boom, cutting a little bit. Which is already there. It's not a big of a difference. Remember that we don't see all the dots that were recorded. There's actually more dynamics being recorded than what we actually see here. So there's variation here that we can see. Okay, so that's for horns, so NLS, and a tiny bit of, again, API 550A. It's nothing, it's just a little bit of boost at 1.5. Let's see the difference. Let's solo it. There's some magic happening here, huh? Let's see if we can find longer notes. There's some brightness to the brass, and it's not even that big of a high frequency, but it works great with horns around this area. So 2 dBs at around 1.5K. Let's go to the trumpets. They will come towards the end here. And they play with horns. Same thing. And you will say, hey, it would make a lot of sense here separating those short notes from the long notes, right? The thing is, they just feel so natural. And they don't sound that perfect when isolating that track. And the trumpet section is that instrument, and happens the same with trombones. When they play alone, and we are used to, we are used to think about the trumpets like that powerful instrument or section that sounds so loud. But the thing is, the actual range, the frequency range of the trumpets that we are able to hear, it's not the full body sound of a trumpet. It's they are sitting quite far away. There's a lot of absorption. They sit behind a lot of instruments. We've got all the, behind a lot of people. We've got all the strings in front of them. So there are a lot of frequencies and reflection that get absorbed from the trumpets. And at the end, what we hear is a thinner sound, and the rest of the orchestra will hide the lowest part of the trumpets. So that's the type of sound that we get. So again, they've gone through NLS. Let's hear the difference. We didn't hear the difference before. Let's just hear the difference here, just with trumpets. Not major difference. Just a little bit of flavor. The thing is, by using this knob, we do hear a difference, because it's actually the difference that we can hear is soft, loud, soft, loud. But the thing is here, it's hearing the change in color. So I brought it here, I brought down some dBs, so when I bypass it, it sounds the same in volume. But what we have to sort of try to hear is the timbre difference. Somehow this plugin just works with brass. Here's the one with horns, with bypass. Bypass. It's subtle again. Okay. So let's see how the brass works with the rest of the instruments. Okay, and this part here will come the trumpet first and then the horns. Actually, the trumpet takes on the strings melody, and then we've got this counterpoint when the melody goes down. This usually is the moment where you want to bring up the horns, because it's this, it's this counterpoint that works so good that you want to bring them up. Let me just put this in context. And it works good, and you want to go like, I want this to sound much louder, and you'll come like this, and it sounds good when you are mixing, but then it's just too loud. No, we want to leave it natural. Okay, so that's the brass. Let's see the choir. Choir usually will have a lot of reverb, but sometimes it just won't work because it already came with a lot of reverb, and this patch, it did have a lot of reverb because I enhanced the far mics and it came with some pre-built reverb. I wanted to add more reverb, it just didn't work. It made it feel too wet and too far. Sounds great here, right? When you put it in context. It's just too much. It's just too much. You have to switch and bypass it in context. If you closely hear to this, when you are playing this in context and you activate reverb, it's like they singing far, far away, like in another bigger, too big of a room. So a little bit of NLS here as well. Let's solo. The reason is they're playing with it does make a little bit of different saddle as always, but the same things that we've got with horns and brass, because they're playing together actually. Let's actually without the choir, the reverb. See, could you feel before it was like horns, great, okay, but in the choir it's like just two different spaces, two different depths, and we don't want that. So with the reverb, it's different places. We want it in the same place. We have to use our ear to sort of match that. Here with a trumpet. Just work great together. Okay, so that's for you could see a little bit of automation here, helping the melody, helping the musicality of this region. And finally, the rest of the brass, which actually, if the okay, they work great together. This is basically some long notes brass harmonies, and so it made sense bouncing all those tracks together. So a tiny bit of NLS. That's super subtle. It brings a little bit of that analog flavor to it. And a little bit of rebalancing the panning a little bit, because the way it was arranged for the left part, it sounded a little bit softer in volume, and just adding 1 dB to the left part. See, Sonar is one of these sequencers where you can have control over the left and the right side. You basically you have this pan knob, and if you bring this thing here, basically what it does is bringing down the right volume, and if you bring this here, you're bringing down the left volume. You don't have control over where you want each channel. And there's this plugin in Sonar where you can move. Okay, this is the left side, left. Okay, and you may want to have the left here or the left here, right, and the right here. So it's a thinner sound. Let's actually hear the difference. It's muted. So here we just can like make left and right, okay? But maybe we want a thin left or a thin right, because left could be something like that. Left, that's left. But that's left as well. It's a thinner left. Or we may want to invert left and right. And all of a sudden we've got the trumpets left and the horns right. Okay, so with this plugin we've got more control, and the thing that I need this plugin for is basically bringing up the left side of it, so horns, to sort of compensate this part with the rest of the arrangement. That's what I did. It's just a technical thing, it's nothing to do with sound really, it's more of a balancing arrangement thing that we tweaked during the mixing. Flute. Let's go with the flute. There's a melody at the beginning. Okay, quite a lot of reverb. It's an instrument that didn't come with too much reverb, so we added it afterwards. Fairly long reverb, not that long, but it's at almost a 50%, which is a lot. Okay, it's a long reverb without. Very close. Sounds okay, but okay. Something that I didn't mention is every single channel will have this analog module inserted. This one. For a tiny bit of analog flavor, every one of them, but the ones that actually have the NLS inserted. So the brass won't have this, which is the same, it's sort of a similar thing, but NLS just works good with brass, so I deactivated this one. So that's what we've got for the flute, and a little bit of automation, as you can see. Flute comes here as well at the end. Let's see, that goes with the trumpet, so you could figure. Okay, can you see how the flute is there? It's just adding a little bit more of brightness to the trumpet sound, but definitely sits behind the trumpet's sound. Okay, in this track we've got an electric bass. Very subtle, a little bit of NLS again, and some extra bottom end. That's why we got rid of the bottom end for the cellos in the first place, because we already had that low end. Here's the brass. Here's the now. Okay. That's it for the bass. We could compress it a little bit, but we just didn't in this track. Let's see with the in context. Okay, and it comes here as well. Which it goes with who? With the timpani, right? Right, it's just adding a little bit of a bottom end, shorter notes. Okay, let's jump to the percussion. So in the percussion I separated the Mark III because I wanted to add a ton of reverb. This is a 11 seconds reverb with mostly reverb. Let's actually listen, just that's it, okay, with the reverb. Super long reverb, helps connecting sections because the reverb tail keeps going when the next section starts, and it doesn't create any madness because it's just very high frequencies, and actually it's not that long, even though 11 seconds. It doesn't feel like 11 seconds, it's not 11 seconds actually. So got rid of everything below 2K. And some reverb, didn't compress this one. Let's see the high percussion. Can you see how soft, low in volume this is? But then it cuts through the mix because it's a very thin sound. Plus it is a very open mix, that section over here, it's a very open and clear arrangement. For this one, a little bit of EQ, enhancing the high frequencies, and basically cutting everything. See, that's a very drastic EQ. It's a low shelf, cutting 9 dBs, starting at 400, just getting rid of the low frequencies, especially it makes a difference here. Let's hear. Alright, we don't want that. Okay, just cutting that, and then adding a little bit of treble and getting rid of some irritation. So I've even compressed here. Sometimes we want to compress percussion. It's a very subtle percussion, and this track includes non-percussive things. So I've even compressed this track, and I didn't need it. This is one of those moments where you find that you needed a cymbal roll and it wasn't here, so basically we just copy and paste it to another track, and that's it. That's like recomposing while you are mixing. Let's go to the percussion mid. It's not like mids because the timpani sounds lower, but it's just the way I named it. It's high, mid, and low percussion, or the low percussion is it's lower in a way. And it's not that much lower than the timpani, it's just maybe not orchestral percussion, lower orchestral, not lower non-orchestral percussion. But let's go back to the timpani. So there's a little bit of NLS as well. NLS works good with brass and percussion. So snare and timpani, a little bit of NLS. I could have compressed a little bit, I didn't. What I did, it's actually a little bit, you see, it's 0.75 with real low in the mix, a little bit of reverb. Let's see the difference. Let's first see the NLS. Okay, adds a little bit of body to the sound, and then the reverb. See that thing at the end? Without. So that's it. And then for the low percussion, which actually is not that low, it includes like mid, it's not just low, it includes mids and lows, and it's non-orchestral. In this one we did compress. So that's the first thing we did. We did compress a little bit with a multiband compressor, and then we applied a little bit of EQ to enhance the highest frequencies and cut a little bit of irritation and the lower end, which wasn't helping. We'll see that in a second. Let's see how the compression is working. Basically, you can see that's compressing a little bit more here and here. You know how a compressor works? It's basically, you've got the same elements but in different bands. So it's cutting As usually we will cut, when it comes to percussion, we will cut something around 2 or 3 dBs, and we will bring it up 2 or 3 dBs. So basically we are compressing the signal and gaining and adding a sense of loudness to that track. Without, see? Without. Okay, so cutting, you can see how all this is cutting, and it was at 0, and this is like the makeup thing, so we're bringing this up 3 dBs, something like that. So everything that we are cutting, you know, everything that we are reducing with the compression, we are bringing up afterwards in the output. And the API. It already sounded good, but with this EQ, it adds a little bit of definition and gets rid of the frequencies that aren't helping. So with, without, with, without. Those mid frequencies aren't helping really. Those mid-low frequencies, 0.8, 800. With. It's just more clarity, more definition. It may sound thinner when you are comparing, but when we are hearing the whole mix, it helps. Okay. And they will work better with the snare here. Finally, let's take a look at the pianos in Celesta. For the piano, the CLA2A to me makes the piano sound good. So if you ever need to bring up the volume piano and also reduce some of its peaks, this module here does a really good job. Instead of running it through NLS, for example, I just use this one. It does a good job. It's subtle. Whenever we have reverb, it's hard to tell the difference. Let's come here. So this is the other one. Let's get rid of this one. Piano with less reverb here. Without. With. Okay. Another. Without. It's a little bit of loudness, analog flavor, and cutting some peaks. So that's for both pianos. And then basically reverbs. This one has more reverb, this one has less reverb. I'm using this B2 film piano preset. It works good with pianos. Just feels, it's a very long reverb. Again, this piano needed a lot of reverb. It's another section. This one, it's more of an orchestral piano and needed to be more in the orchestra. And you may think, well, the more reverb, the more it'll blend and the farther away it'll sound. Yes, but this one was featured, and it's an area where we didn't have much instrumentation. The rest of the arrangement has as many instruments, as many layers, and especially long notes. It's all short notes. And for the piano, which was the featured element here, needed to feel the sound. Let's listen to this part. Whereas in this part, it's more of an orchestral piano. It sits behind in the mix. And we don't need more sound. We are trying to keep it as clean and separate as possible. So that's for the piano. And then we've got a Celesta and an ARP. The Celesta sounded great as it was, so we didn't do much. Basically, we added a little bit, again, for every one of them, a little bit of analog emulation. And for the celeste, a tiny bit of reverb. See, it's a long reverb, but not that much reverb. It's a tiny bit. See, we're sharing the film piano presets to sort of make sure that they go together, because they do go together. So a tiny bit of reverb. It came with quite a lot of reverb, and the celeste, it's an instrument already. It's got, every note's got a long decay, so we didn't need that much. Still is there. You can. It's a long reverb, but it's so low in volume that we can't even. It's a long reverb. See, it's a beautiful reverb for like pianos, celestas, harps, etc. But it's so soft that we can barely hear it. And finally the ARP, same concept, just a tiny bit of reverb. It was an ARP that sounded good as it was. That's it. Let's see the reverb, a tiny bit of reverb, same, going with the ARP. So those instruments will work together here. What we do have here, it's a lot of automation. We can see it here, for example, which when we put everything together, and it does that small difference. But if it wasn't there, it's, you know, you wouldn't hear that thing here there. It's okay, but the magic happens here. With that ARP moment, just one note that we can hear, but it feels natural, it feels beautiful. Finally, we've got this bass with a very long reverb loaded, and we've got some tracks with some sends ready that go to this reverb, which basically are the strings, the long high, the very long low, and the master track. You can see it here. So the master track, which will be the one that makes a bigger difference. We've seen that in the last module, but let's just see this again here, and you will see this knob going up, sending to this reverb. Okay. That tail. Helps connecting both sections happening here. And it's happening here with the long strings. We've seen that before. You can hear just the strings with a longer tail. Just the strings. And for the lows here, it's just an effect. It's very subtle. But that's it. As you could see, again, very subtle things, but when you put them all together, they make the music feel more alive. The listener will perceive more detail, and in a way, everything is in its own place. expanding mixing depth or creating depth of field, which basically will mean being able to put some elements in the foreground and some elements in the background. The concepts that we are going to learn here will apply when mixing orchestral music, but they will actually come real handy when mixing hybrid music, when we are mixing orchestral instruments with synthetic sounds. Okay, so when we are mixing, we've got three sonic dimensions. We've got left to right, top to bottom, and front to back. So left to right, it's a simple concept. Basically, we can move things by panning them. We can move them a little bit to the left or to the right. But we can also move things around by choosing different patches. Most of the orchestral libraries, if we load violins, they will already sound to the left. If we load cellos, they will already sound to the right. That's because the way they got recorded. Okay. Now, then we've got top to bottom, and that's simple as well. It comes with the arrangement. So when we are arranging, when we are orchestrating, some instruments will be more in the higher range, like piccolos, flutes, violins. Some of them will be in the middle, clarinets, violas, and others will be in the low end, cellos, double basses. That's the way we arrange, the way we orchestrate. But again, when we are mixing that with synthetic elements, we can enhance that by brightening them up a little bit, maybe with a cue, or adding some subsonic frequencies. Okay, and finally we've got front to back. So imagine imagine an orchestra, right? You are in the conductor's position, and close your eyes. You'll be able to hear the two sonic dimensions that we described. We've got left and right, we've got high and low, but also even with our eyes closed, we will be able to feel the difference between the instruments that are closer, like the violins, those that are more in the mid-ground, like woodwinds and brass, and those that are way back at the end, like the percussion section. Well, that's what we will try to achieve as well when mixing orchestral instruments, which they will already sound left or right or front to back because the way they got recorded. But we can achieve the same things with synthetic elements. And we will see that in detail in the next video. But when assessing where to put some elements in the mix, I may find one sound that I want to be in the foreground, right? I'll put this one right in the center. I'll maybe filter it with the band pass, and we'll narrow it down by smashing it with a compressor to make it small. Next, I will find elements in the mix to place them far left and far right. And I'll maybe add like a medium ambience, and I'll try to create like a wide sonic spectrum. Finally, I'll look for sounds to put way back. I'll use maybe like a 7-second reverb and virtually not direct signal to put you away from what's in the foreground. So keeping in mind these three dimensions, you should be able to create deep and engaging sonic pictures and add emotion to the music that you are mixing. This is my sonic canvas. So when I'm mixing, I'll open this project, and I'll have these 7 basses or aux tracks or effects tracks, and I'll load my audio tracks here. At the moment we just have one, but above those effects tracks we will import the stems that we exported from our mixing project. So let's see what we've got here. Those are preset effect channels with preloaded plugins, reverbs and delays that will help me recreate that depth, that sonic dimension front to back, and will come real handy when we are dealing with synthetic sounds, when we are mixing a hybrid mockup. Most of the orchestral elements won't need much of this, even though we may use a little bit of it. But again, those will come real handy with all the synthetic elements. So we've got short reverb, mid reverb, long reverb, and we've got short delay, long delay, an effect sense that I'll explain in a bit, and a max bass. We'll explain this one at the end. So for the short reverb, I've got this reverb loaded here. Things to notice, it's a 1.2 decay time with a little bit of pre-delay because I want to separate it from the sound. You know, I don't want it to be part of the sound. I actually want it to be a different dimension than the actual sound. Another thing to notice is the amount of top end that I put on it. I like a bright, short reverb. I want it to be crisp and punchy in a way. And finally, you can see how this one, it's quite narrow. So let's play this. This is basically an ARP note, right? And we're gonna play it with and without this short reverb. So without and with. This is sort of like a drums reverb, like a small drums room type of reverb. It'll add a little bit of ambience to the sound. The second space, it's a medium space. I generally like to use the EMT 140. I usually choose either plates or chambers because they have long, even decay times. You can see the length is about 3.4, something like that. Roll off some of the low frequencies and brighten a little bit of the high frequencies. Another thing to notice is because those are basses and we will reach those through sends in our tracks, all of them are 100% wet. Okay, 100% wet. Third space, it is a long reverb. I choose a cathedral setting. Usually cathedral patches are longer and warmer. Things to notice about this is that it is a 7.5 second long, and the key about this reverb is that it uses a little bit of chorus, which adds depth to the reverb. So those are my three reverbs, which when it comes to synthetic elements would allow me to have them positioned front or in the background. Let's hear the difference. So that's without. With the short reverb, mid reverb, that was the plates, the MT 140, so 3.5 seconds long, and finally long reverb. This one is real long. Now this wouldn't make that much sense when it comes to orchestral instruments. But again, when we apply this to synthetic sounds, if we want to move something way back, let's imagine like a drone or like a synth that we want to keep way back, we would make this send pre-fader. So the fader does not affect the amount of send. We would bring down the fader. But still, we're sending signal here. And everything that we get is the processed sound. Adding a little bit of dry, without, the next two effects that I've got are delays. So I've got a short delay. This is a simple delay plugin from Cubase. And the things to notice about this is that the left side it's 91 milliseconds and the right side it's 67 milliseconds. And I've got no feedback at all. The idea for me is to be able to slaughter things in a stereo. So if you take a mono, you can split it in a stereo a little bit and make it a little bit wider, and separating things from the sounds that you are trying to put in the middle. So because it's got this tiny bit of delay difference between left and right. If we send a sound to this short delay, we're making this pre-fader and bring down the dry signal. We're gonna open the stereo width. You can hear how the right side comes a little bit earlier than the left side. So without, with, without, with, next we've got a long delay. In this one, I'm timing the delay to the tempo map that's in my session. So quarter note on the left, dotted quarter note on the right, so things don't feel symmetrical. A little bit of feedback, because I want them to decay smoothly. And I also have the high cut that I use it in maximum because I want to warm decay time in my delays. I don't want them to be actually full range. I want them to be a little bit filtered down, a little bit warmer. So we are creating this ping pong effect to separate things to the left and right dimension. I added a little bit of echo effect reverb for more of a vintage reverb feel. So here's the sound without delay and the sound with delay. Without, with, we are creating another dimension. We are adding depth to our mix. Again, we are using an acoustic instrument, but these concepts will apply most of the times to synthetic elements. This is an effects send. Sometimes I want for my delays to be somehow filtered, enabling me to have like a different sound and sonic integrity to the delays. As you can see, I filter some of the bottom end and top end, creating a sort of a telephone effect, and then I run it through these waves SSL, but you can choose any EQ that you want. So basically, beyond the filtering that we've done, I actually wanted to EQ a little bit and have like +9 at 1.k and also +9 at 2.5k, rolling some of the bottom end under 300 cycles. So it's a way to filter my delay sense. So this one goes to my long delay. So there are two ways to send to the long delay. It can be direct, or we can send it through this sort of effect sense and then to the delay. So again, the dry sound, long delay, and now through the effects send, which will also send it to the long delay. Another thing that I do is the return of my long delay goes to the long reverb. So when my delays are delaying, they are actually hitting reverbs. It's pretty much like a natural acoustical environment. Here's the long delay, and you can see how there's a send to the long reverb. And same thing, if I'm choosing to hit the long delay through the effect send, then this one will hit my long delay, and then the long delay will hit the long reverb. And finally, there's max bass. First thing that we've got to notice is that this one is a mono effects channel. So what I loaded here is a max bass plugin from Waves. And basically when you load this plugin, it'll look something like this, where you've got the original sound and also the synthetic max bass. So what I did here is using this plugin in a like dry wet sort of effect. So I brought down the original bass, I moved this to max bass, brought this down to 70, ratio 1.5, this one it's 6 dBs per octave, and after that I inverted the phase. You can see how I swap the phase. I found with this particular plugin that if you flop the phase, then the sound actually gets deeper and actually shoots for that elusive 20-30 cycles, which actually you can hear. So this is an ARP. It doesn't have a lot of bass, like low-end information, but still, let's get rid of this one. Let's make this real aggressive, and let's bring up the gain for this effects channel, and let's try without and with, right? And you can hear the 20-30 hertz. Let's try without, with, and you can actually hear the 20-30 hertz. I think some subsonic frequencies there. So that's it, setting up the spaces. So with that, you should be able to recreate depth of field and mimic or enhance the sonic picture, especially when you've got synthetic elements around the orchestral live instruments. So the files that you will find down below are the stems that get sent to the dub session. So usually in a professional project, you'll compose and then you'll do the mixing, or the mixing engineer will mix. And then instead of sending like a stereo or a 5.1 track, it's very common to send stems. So during the dub session, they can readjust balance, because maybe there's dialogue and they may want to keep some of the background stems, but they want to get rid of some of the staccato strings or some of the percussion, something like that. So it's common. Now, if you've got the chance to, get the pre-mixed stems, well, it's a great opportunity for you to go ahead and analyze how they created that sound. So what you will find are, for example, the strings, or the long strings and staccato strings. You may find the percussion or guitars, brass and woodwinds, synths. So what I do when I have the chance to isolate or listen just to one family, like the strings, for example, is, depending on the, if I have to create a mock-up that sounds like, sort of this more Hans Zimmer type of sound, well, we've got these stems that allow us to, okay, let's listen for, let's take a close look to the strings and let's see how they sound. And well, we may not have a library that sounds exactly the same, but when we are trying to go for this more artificial, modern, more like this orchestral, cinematic, orchestral, remote control type of sound, sometimes we may wanna slightly modify those acoustic instruments. I'm not a huge fan of that. I think that if you really want to make it sound realistic, then we shouldn't really EQ or compress the acoustic orchestral instruments. Now, if you want to go for that sound, then use these stems and try to mimic the sound, right? So for example, grab the strings, And if we don't have a library that sounds exactly the same, which we won't have a library that sounds exactly the same because they use their own libraries, or they use just a different library that you aren't using. If that's the case, well, you can use a little bit of EQ to sort of find that tone, and you can match EQ. You can do that with FabFilter Pro Q2, or you can use Isotope Match EQ setting. So the sound of the strings, you know, it's a bit closer. Your strings are a bit closer to what you listened in the stems. Another thing that you can do, and I think this is quite more effective, it's, you know, mixing different sample libraries. Sometimes maybe one strings library that you've got doesn't have that, you know, attack, but maybe you've got another one that does have attack, but it doesn't sound that big. So sometimes combining different sample libraries will make it. And you may think, well, yeah, but it's gonna sound bigger or non-realistic. Well, we aren't going for that realistic type of sound. It may sound like we've got 30 cellos, and that's not exactly how it would be in a real orchestra. Well, sometimes we are not going for that realistic sound, so it's not the advice that I would give you if you are going for a realistic orchestral sound. But if you're going for more like a cinematic modern sound, which somehow we are getting used to it, and we at some point we may think this is the orchestral sound, but it is not. It's not like the Michael Giacchino type of sound. Or when you go listen to an orchestra, it's very different. It's but if you are going for that sound, hey, grabbing different sample libraries and trying to find the sound by combining them, they can be an option. So grab two different sample libraries, you know, balance them differently. Maybe you may want to grab like an ensemble patch and also add some cellos from another library. It's a little bit of experimentation. But again, you have a chance by using these stems to, well, isolate those sounds that usually we'll just hear in the stereo track from Spotify or from the CD, and won't be able to exactly hear what the bassoons are doing, what the woodwinds are doing. Well, here we've got the chance. So the mastering process consists of a series of steps that they are not intended to make your track sound better. It's actually, you know, the mastering is ensuring that your track sounds loud. And when we say loud, we don't mean that it has to be super compressed and reducing all the dynamic range of your track. You still want to keep the dynamics while making it sound loud. We may, in a subtle way, shape the overall EQ of the track. Also, we may give it a little bit of an analog flavor, analog saturation, and finally we may make it sound a little bit wider. So usually the plugins chain that I'll use is, first I'll have an EQ. In this case I use the Manley Massive Passive, but you can use any EQ. You can use FabFilter, Pro Q, or any other EQ. This one sounds very nice and also gives it an analog tubes type of flavor to the track. But basically we will have an EQ, then we will have some sort of plugin that emulates analog saturation. I usually had Vintage Warmer too. These days I'm using the Studer 800, gives that magnetic saturation type of effect. But Vintage Warmer would be an alternative that actually sounds great. Then we'll come here and we will have a little bit of multiband compression to reduce the dynamics. And I'll use this module just if it's not a purely orchestral track. If it's a hybrid track, I will use it. If it's an orchestral track that includes some non-orchestral percussion, I'll use it. But if it's like a regular orchestral track, I will rarely compress. Then we will use this exciter module and we'll enhance some of the high frequencies. The major is gonna make especially the mid and high to sound a little bit wider and to narrow a little bit the low frequencies. We'll explain this more in detail in the next videos. And finally, a maximizer limiter to bring up the volume. And before we export, we will activate dithering to make sure that we get rid of the conversion exporting noise if we are working at a different resolution than the one that we are exporting it to. After the EQ, I'll usually have an analog emulator plugin or some sort of plugin that gives an analog type of sound saturation. Usually I may use Vintage Warmer. Actually, I used it in the past, and that one would go right after the EQ. In this case, for this track, I used the Studer A800, and because this is a recorder, I put it before the EQ. Actually, I use this one because it's got a vintage preset that does a really good job. So I put it before the EQs because this machine was intended to record. It's not like a mastering machine. So I used it sort of like a reamp type of thing, like recording the stereo export to the tape and then playing it back and running it through the EQs, etc. So that's why it's before the EQs. If it was like a regular saturation plugin, maybe I would put it after. But you can A/B test and see which one you like better. Doesn't really make that big of a difference. So for this one, what I tried is this to be going to the red area where it started creating this tape saturation that I wanted. And other than that, I just selected this preset. I usually go with classic or film. For this one, I choose the vintage. Depending on what preset you use, it'll add a tape or another, and it'll change the speed. So for the vintage, the only thing that I did is come here and make sure that the noise is off, because it added a little bit of noise just for realism. And what I tried here is for the input to make sure that the boometer would be in the red area for the loudest part. So maybe we could push it a little bit farther. Now, whenever I bring... Now, if I bring up the input, I will bring down the output. So the more we push this, the more analog tape distortion or saturation we'll start getting. Now, tape saturation is very different than digital saturation or tube saturation or analog saturation. It's got a very specific tone, pleasant in a way, and depending on the speed, it also have a different flavor. Let's give this a try. But again, we don't want this to drastically saturate. We just want to be subtle with that. But, you know, just for you to hear the difference. At this point, it may sound like it's saturating, but it's just the tuba sound. Okay, so that's it. So far, let's see what we've got. And let's bypass the EQ and the Studer. So let's start bypass, and then we'll activate the plugins. So we can see how when it's bypassed, it's got a somehow a bigger and more flat type of sound, and when we activate all the plugins, we are getting that more vintage, mid-rangey type of sound, which for in this case, that's what we wanted. Okay, If that wouldn't be the case, we would have chosen another reference track, which would have helped us with another EQ curve. But as you saw, it's very subtle. We did a little bit of EQ, just a tiny bit, to give it the flavor that we want. We could go without EQ, and then it would have the exact same flavor, and we could just add a little bit of analog saturation, and then control dynamics, add a little bit of exciter, and making it sound a bit wider, and finally louder. But I always like revisiting the EQ to give it the flavor that this cue needs. Or for example, if you are composing for a soundtrack and all the tracks, they have to sort of sound the same, you may have the same overall EQ for all the cues. Now let's go to the next step, will be dynamics, exciter, imager, maximizer. So simple and easy. Let's break this down step by step. And the first thing that we want to do is we're gonna decide if we're gonna apply a little bit of EQ to this track or not. Sometimes we may not need to EQ. In the mastering process, when we are EQing an already mixed track, like in a stereo track or 5.1 track, this is not the place to fix any problem. So if the double basses are too hot in the mix, it's not the place here to just cut some frequencies in the low end or like this because they are too loud in the mix. No, it's not. We aren't EQing here for fixing problems. If we are EQing here, is for like shaping the final flavor for this track. So sometimes we may apply an EQ that's gonna make it gain a little bit of clarity or add a little bit of treble or reinforce the low frequencies, or we maybe want it to sound a little bit more vintage, which is what we are gonna intend in this track. So we will give it a little bit more of a vintage EQ, this one with sort of subtle, but maybe getting rid of the high frequencies and so the low frequencies type of EQ, or more. We would have to find the spot where to cut, but this would go for more of a vintage type of sound. But again, we aren't EQing to fix any problem. Now you'll say, okay, good. If I had a hard time EQing my stems, my instruments, what type of EQ should I use here? I don't even know where to start. Well, what we are going to do here is we are going to bring a track that will be here as a frame of reference. Okay, so we should find a track that sounds similar to what we've done. So what this does is provides you with a frame of reference. So your track, you'll make it sound similar to this track. Okay, if you're composing the soundtrack for a movie, for example, they maybe gave you a temp track and you are writing music very similar to a temp track. Then you will have those reference tracks that you can use. Then you will have those tracks that you can use. Or sometimes you're writing library music and they gave you some reference music, or you're using some reference music that you want your music to sound like. So again, by having those tracks, you'll listen to this track and then you'll listen to your track and you'll try to make it sound similar. We've got some tools that will help us analyze and match the EQ. But first we have to find those tracks. So this process will help, especially at the beginning. Maybe later in the future you don't need like a reference track. You already know what to EQ or what frequencies to cut or boost, but it's very helpful at the beginning. So for my track, I didn't have a reference track. So for this video, I looked for a track that sounded similar to mine. My track is like a spy thriller fun type of track. And so I tried to find something and I spent some minutes looking for a similar track. And finally I came up with this Mr. Bean soundtrack. And I didn't find anything like that, like my track, but I selected several parts of the soundtrack that sort of had the same instrumentation and arrangement. So when we are selecting a track that's similar to our track, it has to be sort of in the same range, the same orchestration, same arrangement, same instruments. Okay. Otherwise, when we are analyzing the track, if this track has like a triangle and some piatti and our track does not have that, then the analyzer will find those frequencies and will try to enhance those in our track. But because our track doesn't have instruments that have a lot of high frequencies, the match EQ tool is gonna make things that don't make sense and will bring up some frequencies so our track sounds similar to the other one. But since our track doesn't have the triangle and the piatti, it's gonna artificially boost some of the high frequencies, and we don't want that. Anyway, this is my track. So basically it includes strings, a tuba, a drum set, and a Rhodes type of piano. So this is the end of the track. At the beginning it's a little bit more relaxed. Okay, it includes an ARP as well. So what I found that was similar, or the closest that I could find, is specific moments of the Mr. Bean Holidays movie soundtrack. And let's take a listen. Let's get rid of all the... Okay, so that's one. This part includes a little bit of high woodwinds, which mine does not include. Mine has some bassoons and bass clarinets, but we could hear some flutes here, so that's gonna be a little bit problematic. But if we are aware of that, we can correct the match EQ. And finally, so what I wanted for my track is to sound as realistic as possible and as acoustic and orchestral, and also having a little bit of that vintage type of feel. So everything that I've done during the mastering, I had that idea in mind. That doesn't mean going like drastic, cut some frequencies and boost some other frequencies. Is using the equipment like the plugins and if you've got analog emulation plugins or analog EQs, or when you're in specific modules that will allow you to choose for different flavors, tape, retro tube, it's choosing the ones and choosing them by ear, not just because of the icon and the name. So again, just keeping that in mind, that I wanted this acoustic, orchestral, vintage, just a tiny bit, not too much of sound, and so everything that I've done was towards that. So back to EQ and having a frame of reference, what we want to do is, let's get rid of this plugin that we inserted before, and basically what we are going to do is we are going to analyze our track, and then we're going to analyze the reference track, and then we will use a plugin that will tell us what EQ should we use. So this track sounds similar to this one, okay? And this is not magic. This is not gonna make our track sound exactly the same, but it's gonna give us an idea of what frequencies should we cut or bust, so we get closer to the sound that we would like to. So there are different plugins that will do that. And you can use actually the one that we got rid of, which is ProQ 2. And it's got this little module here, and you'll do the match EQ. I'm used to the the one that comes with isotope ozone. So before we do that, important is to make sure that there aren't any other plugins loaded or changing the character or applying any effect on any of the tracks. So we are gonna bypass all the plugins. Second important thing is to match the volume of those tracks, because as you can see, this is my track, okay? And those are fragments from Mr. Bean's Holidays movie soundtrack. So as you can see, it's much louder. So what you want to do is for it to be similar in loudness level, okay? So let's zoom this a little bit. And what we want to do is for this waveform to be closer to these ones, okay? So this is volume, and this is the loudest of the four. So I'll try for this one to be similar to this one, and for this one to be similar to this one here, this area, and this one to be similar to this area. So we sort of get the same volume. Okay, that would be sort of thing. Maybe here. Like this, maybe a little bit less. And finally, something like that. Okay, just sort of the same volume. So that's all we need. Next thing that we are gonna do is here in isotope ozone, we'll come to the EQ, and if you don't have any module loaded, basically you will click here, click to insert module, EQ, and in EQ we will go here to matching. We'll hit here, and remember that if it's not activated, you're not gonna hear the difference. Remember to activate it. So here we will analyze the reference track. So we'll hit capture and we'll hit play, and we'll wait for it to listen and draw the frequency curve. And then we'll do the same here with our track. And when we've got both curves, then we will hit on, and it'll draw the EQ curve that it would match, that it would make our track sound closer in EQ to the reference track. So let's go ahead, let's analyze this part. Capture and play, capture, play. And stop. Good, we've got the curve that it analyzed. Let's go with our track and capture and play. And stop. So right away, let's get rid of the core. So right away, what we can see, it's our track is the yellow one. And the first thing that we can see is that it's got more top end. Sorry, it's got more top end and bottom end. Certainly, it's more of a modern sound, but we're aiming for the other sound. So If we activate matching, we will see how the curve will try to compensate and will bring up some of the mid frequencies, and we'll get some of the highs and lows. Let's see that. That's exactly what happened. And we can enhance that. We can see this, we've got this amount fader, which will allow us to have nothing to a lot sort of thing. So usually it'll be like a 10%. And then we've got smoothing, which will be more precision or softer. So this will allow us to see that for our track to sound more similar to the other track, we would need more frequencies here. And we can see that because we've got the yellow line going below the bluish line. So for us to compensate, we would have to bring up like 2 dBs. You see 2 dBs here, 2 dBs up at around those frequencies here, something maybe like 1.5 dBs at around 400, and like 2 dBs at around 2K, or maybe we could have 2 dBs around 1K, 2 dBs around 2K, and then 1 dB around 400, something like that. And then we could cut some of the high frequencies, some of the low frequencies. Now here's the important thing. The Mr. Bean Holidays movie soundtrack was an MP3, and most of the MP3s will cut the high frequency. So this more drastic curve here, it's because the blue, the reference track, it didn't have that information. Those frequencies were cut because it was an MP3 file. So we shouldn't look at this part. We shouldn't go that drastic with the high frequencies. Okay, but there's a big difference here. If our track has more top end, it's more treble, and this one, it's missing that part. We also have the Rhodes, which is a non-orchestral instrument, and usually those will have more high frequencies. So we have to keep that in mind as well. And we also have more low frequencies, more this modern cinematic sound that we may want to get rid of. If we are aiming for that more realistic acoustic orchestral, and even going a little bit into vintage type of sound. So the first thing that we want to do is make sure that we don't have this activated. Otherwise, we're going to have this EQ'd twice, once here and then another time, and the second time here. Okay, so again, we can use any EQ. I'm using those because I like them. We could be using FabFilter Pro Q, the API 550 waves, or even the Cubase or your sequencer EQ. Okay, so doesn't really make a big difference here. I'm gonna use these analog emulations because I'm going for a vintage type of sound, and I want to grab that analog feel. So a little bit around 300, a little bit around 1K, and a little bit around 3K or something like that. We're gonna boost those frequencies, and then we're gonna cut a little bit of the high end and a little bit of the low end. Okay, so let's deactivate this one so it's not affecting. So we're gonna do the mids and highs with the Manley. That's a great job, and we'll use the pull text for the low frequencies. Okay, so we're gonna bypass those. I'm gonna bypass the pull tech. I'm gonna bypass the Manley as well. And let's try to, well, let me real quick explain this. This is an EQ. It looks a bit different than the regular EQ. It's a stereo EQ, which at the moment is linked. So anything that we do here, it's happening in the other side. Okay, so basically you will select if you want to cut or bust. Okay, so if you are cutting, so if you select cut, you're gonna be cutting here like 1 dB, 2 dBs up until 11 dBs. So it would be similar to doing something like this, right? And if we boost, then if we bring this up, we're still like doing something like this. Okay, then we can select the Q factor, narrow, so narrow or wider. It would be like narrow or wider. Okay, and finally selecting the frequency would be like selecting the frequency here. Okay, so that's how this one works. I'm gonna get rid of this one. Okay, so we are not using this one. Sorry. Oh, and finally we can make it a bell or shelf, which would be, we can select to be a bell, or if we go with a shelf, it would be something like this. Okay, so we are not gonna use this one. We're gonna use a massive passive for the mids and highs, and so we're gonna boost those frequencies that we saw here, around 3, around 1 and 300, 1K and 3K. So that's what we did here, around 300 to 270, around 1K and around 3K. And because they're quite close, we narrowed them a little bit. Okay, so let's hear the difference. So here we go, without. As you can see, when we bring it in, it's got that more mid-range type of sound which we want, and that happens because we are boosting this 1K. Let's see, let's hear that. Also a little bit here. And this is just bringing some top end. Okay, now this wouldn't be the type of EQ that I usually would give. Usually I would try to boost the lows and highs and clean a little bit of the mids. That's sort of more of a modern sound. Now if we're going for this more vintage sound, then this EQ makes sense. And we had this frame of reference also because of the track that we used. So final EQ is this one. It's gonna be much more subtle now. But let's still try to hear. Let's focus on just try to listen the snare and the violins when we switch this back and forth. So to start off, and then we'll bring it in. It's very subtle, but it is there. Let's hear the right cymbal. No, right here. Okay, let's start without, and when we bring it in, pay attention of how it adds a little bit of top end. Okay, it is very subtle, but it is there. Now this one is much easier. Okay, this one we will use it for adding a little bit of. Usually I use the Pultec for adding low end. In this case, we're using it to cut a little bit of the low end. So we've got for the low end, you'll select 20, 30, 60, 100, and then you'll bust or cut. You can bust and cut. It's a interesting effect. And then same thing for the high frequencies. You can bust or attenuate. Same thing, okay? Real simple. We're keeping this real simple now. We just want to cut, just for you to hear what this does and why I like it for the low end. Check this out. Well, bring it in. It adds that low end in a very nice and elegant way. But that's not what we want now. We want to actually go the other way around. So let's do that. So I'm gonna cut a little bit and then some of the highs. Okay, so that would be it. Let's hear the difference without. You can hear how when we bring it in, we're losing some of the high end. And it's subtle. Again, we can't, when we are EQing, unless when we are mastering, unless we want to apply a specific effect. Next step is exciter. So an exciter, what basically does, it affects two specific harmonics, and then it gives a feel usually of like brightening the high end. With Ozone 7, we've got different options and fields here. So the dual triode and the triode tubes will sound warmer, similar to this warm preset. The retro is gonna sound very treble, so we have to be careful with that one. Those, something in between. I like this one a lot, but for this example I'm gonna use the retro. Again, we have to use our ear here, not just look at the icon, because this one, we're gonna hear a lot of effect when we bring up those. And as you can see, I added like 0.2, 0.2, 0.1, and nothing for this frequency. Again, I'm choosing to have two small low frequencies and two bigger mid and high. So let's see what's the difference here first, and then let's leave it the way I set it up. So it feels like an EQ, but it doesn't do the exact same thing. It's something that with an EQ we couldn't actually do. So now let's hear the difference with different types of excitement. Okay, it's clearly a difference. I used this one for this track. Again, I usually use a triode. And it's a very, very subtle. I brought it down to +3, plus +03, plus +02, like real subtle. And plus +0.01. And you can still hear a difference. So let's start without, bypassed, and then we'll bring it in. You can pay attention to the strings. Doesn't affect that much to the Rhodes piano, but with the strings you can hear a difference. So this is bypassed. The next step will be dynamics, exciter, imager, maximizer. I'm using Isotope Ozone 7. So When it comes to orchestral tracks, I do not compress. When I have an orchestral track that includes some non-orchestral percussion, then I may compress a bit. This one includes a drum set and the Rhodes piano, which is a non-orchestral instrument. And when it is a hybrid track with 50% synth elements, then I will definitely use this one to control some of the synthetic transients, which usually tend to be more aggressive than the acoustic instruments. So let's activate this one, let's deactivate those. And basically, when you will load Isotope and the dynamics module, you'll see this like those 4 bands. Usually I like bringing those 2 bands down, and I wanna have a wider high and mids and 2 narrow low ends, just because the low ends is the area it's harder to control. So I want to have 2 compressors here. Basically, this is a multi-band compressor, and it's actually a multi-band compressor and limiter. And you know how a compressor works. Basically, you'll have a threshold, right? And the lower you bring the threshold down, the more it'll cut. And then you have a ratio. Okay, the higher the ratio, the more it'll cut. Finally, you have attack and release times. I don't usually mess with those. I'll leave this to 2:1. And then what I will do is, because it's a 90% orchestral track, I will come to the loudest part, and I will make sure that it barely compresses it a little bit. Okay, so let's do that one by one. So what I will do is, for the lower end, I will bring down the compression. For the highest frequencies, I will bring down the compressor. I want to use the limiter. Now for the low area, I may bring down the limiter as well, because it's harder to control the low end. So I'll get this compressing, and then see here, I'll get this to compress a little bit, and then I'll bring down the limiter. A limiter, it's not other thing than a compressor at a ratio of 10:1 or above. Okay, so it's a more aggressive compressor. So as the threshold goes down, it'll start compressing, and if it's not able to compress everything, then we'll bring down the limiter, and it'll be a harder compression. So let's bring this down to 10. Let's bring this up. Okay, let's start. So I'm here, which is the loudest part. When applying dynamics, you want to go to the loudest part. And you can see here, down here, how it compressed 0.1, 0.2 dBs. At 0.4, we don't want to compress more than 1 or 2 dBs max. For this type of track, if it's a hybrid track, you may want to go 2-3 dBs. Okay. It went out almost to 2. Sometimes you can solo just this area, just to hear. That's bypassed. Now active. And just making sure that it still feels natural. And that's all we need to do for dynamics. Again, if it's an orchestral track, I won't apply any dynamics control module here. If it's a hybrid track, like synths, like percussive synths and orchestral instruments, big hits, stuff like that, it's good to have that because we are cutting some non-acoustic transients. And if it's a track like this one, which is mostly orchestral with some non-orchestral instruments, like a bass, like a drums set, well, then it's good to have that in, just in a very subtle way, just to cut some transients here and there. Now let's move on to the E major. And the concept here is that we want to make the track to sound a bit wider. That's exactly what this will do. So the higher we go, the wider it will sound. Now, since this is a multi-band E major, we can select how wide or narrow we want specific frequency range to be. So what we are going to do is we are going to open the highs and mids. And for the lowest, we're going to narrow them a little bit. Because that's something that when mixing electronic EDM or pop music, usually we will want to keep the low frequencies in the center, like the kick drum, the bass, etc. That's something that we cannot do when we are mixing orchestral music, because we are not going to move the double basses to the center. It's not going to sound realistic. Now, when we are mastering, we may bring some of the lowest frequencies a little bit narrower, just a tiny bit. On the other hand, if we've got some hybrid elements when we are composing, we can keep them in the center. But if we want them to sound cinematic, we can just narrow them dead center. We will still need some of the information for those big hits to be left and right, so it sounds big and wide. So as you can see, a little bit wider for the high frequencies, wide but not as much as the high frequencies for the mids. This one we left it the way, well, we brought it down a little bit, and this one a bit farther. So narrow, narrow, wide, wider. So let's hear the difference. Let's start without. And try, if you're using headphones, you'll try to pay attention to the far left and right. Not just that it sort of sounds a little bit louder, but try to pay attention to the width, to the size of the sound. Okay. It's again subtle, but it makes a difference when you put them all together. Let's just enhance one of them just to see the real difference. Actually, let's bring them all down to narrow, and you'll see that the mix goes super narrow. Okay, for the exciter, I like to turn the oversampling on. And basically what it does is, if we are working at 48 kilohertz, it will convert it to 192, and then it will apply the algorithm at 192, and then it'll convert it back to 48 for the next of modules. And this ensures a better performance for the algorithm. And finally, the last module, this is gonna make it sound louder. Gonna activate this. This one is real simple. Basically what you wanna do is just bring this down up until you see the signal hitting the threshold, and then compressing a little bit, and you wanna keep it very subtle again. I like keeping the ceiling not at 0 but at minus 0.1, just in case any transient goes beyond the ceiling. We don't want it to distort when we convert it to MP3 or stuff like that. So let's do that. because we imported this track, which it was in a real low level, we have to bring down this quite a bit. But still we can see it compressing, and I want it to compress to limit actually, but just a tiny bit. You see how it is compressed a little bit? If we go farther, it'll compress even more. We compressed a little bit too much. That's something that we don't want. Let's bring up just 2 dBs up just to have more signal coming in. We wouldn't want that, not even for like library trailer music. We want to just compress it a little bit, just a tiny bit. So we can see how it limited compressed like 1.7 dBs, and we are choosing the loudest part. And because we selected the ceiling at -1 at this point, the loudest peak won't go above -0.1. Finally, the 2 things that you want to do is here you can select IRC 1, 2, 3. Every one of those, it's more CPU intensive. I like to use IRC 4 because this is a mastering project. We don't have any CPU problem here, so I usually use the IRC 4 modern. In this case, I'm using classic again because I want this more vintage sound. That's the only reason why. And then you wanna apply dither just to make sure that if you are converting from 16 to 24, when you're exporting, that it makes sure to move the noise, the conversion noise, to the lowest and the highest ranges so we can't hear it. So that's it, mastering a track. Let's take a listen to it. If this is for a soundtrack, you don't want to change the volume for that track. But if this would be like library music, that it goes for YouTube or a trailer track, something like that, we may want to make sure that the volume, it's sort of, you don't have to reduce the dynamic of the whole track, but sometimes you may want to keep an even volume throughout the track. So that's a little bit of the case. So I brought down the volume like 0.8 dBs here and 1.2 dBs here. So if you're writing for library music, this will help for your track to sound sort of louder all the time, and will help that competing with other tracks. Now, if you're going for that approach, then I would recommend having all the plugins not inserted in the track, but in another track, because otherwise this volume will not affect to the input of your plugins. Because the plugin is, the plugins are inserted here, and the volume that you are automating is here. If you want this volume change to affect your plugins, then you'll have to automate the gain. That'd be a better idea. Or having the plugins inserted in another track and then output this track to the next one and then to the master. Like for example, going like, I think like a group track or something like that, a stereo. And having all the plugins here. And then for this track, to output not to the master stereo, but to the groups, to this one. And now any change in volume is gonna affect to the input of those plugins, okay? And that now it's gonna make it easier for us if, for example, this would be like a trailer track and we really wanna make it sound loud, but we don't want this to sound too compressed, and there are some areas where the music goes louder, and that's pushing our compressors and limiters. Well, there's a trick which is for those areas just to bring them down in volume a little bit, something like that. And it's gotta be subtle, but it usually is subtle. It usually doesn't doesn't feel like bringing down the volume. Now we're bringing down the volume here like 2 dBs, but that's gonna help for the compressor not to kick in. Now this is something that I won't do here because it's a track that sounds very acoustic, but if it's a hybrid trailer track, this can help. Okay, so before we had like 1.5 or something like that, and now that we brought this up, you don't really hear that drop in volume, but it's helping for the compression not to kick in so hard. So 0.4, 0.4. 0.7, something like that. So that's helping a little bit in every band. Okay, not gonna do that now, but just for you to know. So now that we are done, let's give it a listen to the whole track. Let's also activate this so you can see the automation going on. And let's open the different. Let's bring here this one. You know, something that I like to do is using the draw plugin. This is a Waves plugin, and I'll set this one to 14. And so usually I want the music to be around here in the loudest part. If we are here, it's loud and it feels natural, and we still have plenty of dynamics. If we need to sound louder, we can, but then we will start losing those natural dynamics. So this one is for me like a frame of reference. All right, now we've learned the mastering concepts and we've applied them with the plugins that I use. They are not the best plugins. They're just the plugins that I use because I find them convenient, or I've been using them for a while, or there are some things that maybe would be harder to do with other plugins. In this video, we'll try to use more standard plugins or plugins that we could find in our sequencer. We'll try to use some of the stock plugins or some of the alternatives. So we won't be using any UAD plugin. We'll be using some Waves, some stock plugins, and we'll explain, every step, and we'll explain the concept that will apply across the board, no matter what plugin we're using. Okay, so let's dive right into it. So this is the track that we've got, and this is the mix console window, and as usual we will have the track here, and then it's routed to this bus here where we've got all the plugins, because since we've got some automation, this automation is gonna affect to the input of some of the plugins as the limiter and the compressor and the exciter. Okay, so the first thing that we did, a little bit of EQ. So let's see what we've got. We've used Pro Q. We could have used the stock EQ. It's the exact same sound. They don't really color, so they are quite standard algorithms, and they won't apply any analog type of coloration. So what we've done here is we've cut some of the subsonic frequencies. It's not that big of a cut really, and it doesn't affect that much, as we can see. Right there you could see how it cut it a little bit, but just some dBs really. And that's something that we can't really hear, but cutting some of those frequencies are gonna help then other plugins for like the limiter, not having that much low information and not having to cut that much. Right, so then we enhanced a little bit of the around 50, 47.7, and cut it a little bit around 120. And the approach here would be either you have a reference track. In this case, I didn't have a reference track, but we saw that in the EQ mastering video where we had a reference track, and we compared with Isotope, the first track, and our track in Isotope drove a curve. And then we sort of copied or got inspired by that EQ and then replicated it. We used mainly passive in that video. FabFilter could do a similar thing. It's got the analyzer, and we could do a similar thing. In this case, I've used my ear, and I carried a little bit of the math here. I enhanced some of the lower frequencies, and then I gave it a little bit more of definition, bringing up the treble a little bit, just 3 dB. So we are in this 1 to 3 dBs range. Let's hear the difference with and without. It's gonna be this one. If we listen at the shaker, let's pay attention to this part first. If we listen at the shaker, we can see how this enhances a little bit of the high frequencies. So I'm gonna bypass just that one. So let's start without, and then we will add. All right. Then we've got this part here, which enhances the lower frequencies. Let's come here. Okay, so I'm gonna bypass it. So let's start without, and then we'll add it in. It just adds a little bit more weight there. And then this one cleans a little bit. Start without. Again, it's very subtle, but overall it'll add a little bit of definition and clarity and enhance some of the low frequencies. Let's bypass the whole thing, in and out. So let's start without, and now with. right, so that's first step, EQ. Second step, a little bit of analog saturation. So what I did here is I used magneto. It just adds a little bit of tape saturation, and this is a Cubase strip that comes included here, and it looks like this. It just adds a little bit of saturation, something very subtle. If we don't want to use this one, I also tried NLS, and at the moment it's bypassed. But if we would bring that one in, again, it's very subtle analog saturation. So we'll start bypassed. Let's start bypass and then activate it. It doesn't just add a little bit of saturation, but also it changes the image of the mix, opening the mix a little bit and cleaning the center. It's very subtle. Anyway, so we'll keep this one deactivated and we'll bring back magneto. And let's get back here. Because next thing, usually in my mastering plugins chain is an exciter. And the exciter that I could find, usually I use Ozon's exciter. The one that I could find is this Waves Ampex, which I liked quite a lot. It sounds good. Gotta be careful though, because it sounds very, very pleasant, and you can go with too much. Now here I don't have the Ozon's exciter. We had a lot of control. It was a multiband exciter, plus it had different flavors. In this case, this is the exciter. And that's it. We've got an input, an output, and then we've got some analog noise. In this case, we wanted to keep it very clean. We didn't want to add any more, because this one can add some analog saturation as well. But we didn't, when it goes to the red area, and it sounds beefy, it sounds great, but we didn't want that. So we kept it very in the clean area where it wouldn't saturate or distort, and we added a little bit of excitement. This is the effect, and it sounds great again. So it kicks in at around 3 to 6 is quite subtle, and then it gets crazy. But 3, that's that tiny little thing that we need. And we can come here, bypassed, and mix to hear the difference. So let's start bypassed. And again, it's very, very subtle. And the shaker is when where we can actually hear a little bit of excitement. Bypassed, and let's listen closely to the shaker. All right. So that would be the second one. And if you're using this one, you gotta be careful with the noise. You can add noise, and something that in this case we didn't want. Most of the times we won't want any noise. This is the other way around. I usually open the mix first and then I apply excitement. So opening the mix a little bit. In this case, we're using the S1 shuffler version, because if you remember, when we were opening the image, making it wider, we had control over the 4 bands, and we would open in high and mid, so high open a little bit more than the mids, and then the mid loads most of the times we didn't even open it, and then for the lower we would sometimes even bring it down to sort of close the lows more centered a little bit. Shuffle this fader here doesn't do exactly the same, but does something similar. So basically when you load this plugin, it'll start like this at 1 and 1 here. So when we open the mix, we'll go at 1.2, 1.3, something subtle. And then basically this guy here takes control over the low end, because opening the low end sometimes is not that good of an idea. And so basically just, even though you're opening the overall mix, this guy keeps the low end controlled. So that's what we did. And let's take a listen to the difference. So it's gonna be this one, start without, so it's gonna sound a little bit narrower, and then it'll open the mix a tiny bit. Okay, moving on. Then the next thing that we had, it was a multi-band compressor, and that was a built-in module in Ozone. In this case, I've used Waves C6, which it's a similar thing. So when you load the plugin, the 4 bands, 1, 2, 3, and 4, they've got different crossover frequencies. What I did is moving the 2 low frequencies closer, then having 2 bigger mid and high. That's the way I like when it comes to orchestral dynamic control, especially if there's non-orchestral percussion and hybrid elements. And then this plugin also includes 2 more bands, which is this one here, which is here, and then this one here, which is here. All right, and you can control the frequency and the width. So this one frequency, you can have it narrower or wider. All right, so then within each band, these 2 bands plus these 4 bands, you can control gain, which in a way equals to EQing using a multi-band compressor. So you could bring up that band or bring it down. So in a way would be EQing plus, so it's like EQ plus compressing at the same time. So you could do things like that. I want to bring down the mid range, or I want to bring down the mid lows, something like that. Or I want to bring down this specific frequency. We've got more control. So that's a smaller, narrower cut. So that's one thing, gain. Then range is amount of compression. So -3, it's the max amount of compression that I'm gonna have, and I can expand that. For that band, I can have this band to compress more, or just compress a tiny bit. -0.5. That would be the max compression. So in a way, no matter how how hard the compressor knee, or the ratio, or how fast the attack is, or where the threshold is set, it will never compress more than 3 in this case. All right, then we've got the attack, and those controls we have the same controls, except for the range, which is very specific in this plugin. All those controls we've got as well in Ozone. So attack, how fast it'll compress and release. And then we've got threshold, which is this one here. Right, we can bypass, solo, same things that we could do. And we've got different flavors, electro, opto. All right, let's so basically what we did here, real quick, we came to the louder part here, we looped it, and we made sure that the thresholds would be right right above, where the signal would come in. So let's see that. So this one needs to be a little bit higher. So this one corresponds to this one. The lower we bring it, the more it's gonna compress. So let's bring this down and let's take a look at this one. But it's never gonna compress more than 2, right? If we let's go with this one. This one corresponds to this one here, and let's go with a more drastic compression. It's gonna be -10. So the more we bring it down, the more it's gonna compress. And within the compression, we could bring the gain up or down. So in a way, we could have we could have a very aggressive compression with a fast attack, and with a lot of compression. 10 is a lot, while still bringing it up a little bit. So it would be a very compact, even though maybe not the best idea, and not the more natural sounding. So for a very specific element, we could go with that approach. Not here, but just so you hear the effect. So it's the same compression is happening here. It's just we're bringing up the gain, not the input gain, like the overall volume for that range. You can get a massive sound using this thing. So this is gonna be, let's make it easier. 0, -3, and right. That's very fast. So that's it. Again, very subtle compression. Then we've got the limiter. Basically, with the limiter, what we did, it's a very fast release, and minus 0.5 dBs for the output. I always bring it down. I don't have the output at 0. I usually have a minus 0.1 whenever I'm using a maximizer or a limiter that I can't trust. Minus 0.5, so half dB down for this one, in case some of the transients it is not able to limit. And so basically what we did is just we brought up around 11 dBs, brought down the release, so it's a very fast limiter, and brought down of half dB the output. It's going to be very subtle. This part is compressing 1 dB, and at the end, three dBs, which is okay. So the one thing that we did, and before all that, and we didn't mention, is automation. This automation that we can see here. So we did two things here. We balanced the two sections. First, this is the first section. This is the second section. Second section is a little bit louder. We want it a little bit more, louder. This part, bigger. Action, big percussion. So that's what we did, one thing. And the other thing is we gave the track a little bit more of emotion here and there. So we sometimes I like riding the track a little bit. So that's the big percussive part. Let's take a listen to this. just accenting those a little bit more, a little bit. Let's not read, and it's gonna sound like this. And now width. Just accents and that percussion. It happens at the beginning, very noticeable. Without, it's gonna sound like okay. But with, you're making sure sort of to impress the listener for the first beat. Whenever I'm doing that, I make sure that it's not compressing too much, because again, in this track, which is this track, it's routed to the bass with all the plugins and compressors. So these levels are gonna affect this bass here for some of the compressors input. So whenever I'm doing those things, I make sure that I am not overloading the input of any of the compressors input, or sounds too loud, or the limiter. So compressing, overall compression, not too much. 1.6 dBs, so not that big of a problem. And I like using this plugin as Waves Draw, and basically when you load this plugin, it'll open like this, and I like selecting -14 for this red area to move at -14, and that for me is the limit. So generally when the music's playing, it's around this range. And whenever I have a climatic moment or big percussion, then it goes higher. For example, here. So big hit, climatic moment approaching. Right, at the beginning as well. And the big percussion moment is gonna be super loud, but again, we wanted this effect. Especially with the automation. Let's get rid of the automation and let's look at this. So -8.9 with the automation. -7.6, which are those dBs. We're going from -3.5 to -0.5. So it's those 3 dBs, a little bit compressed, which are those 2 dBs, 2 dBs and a half of difference that we can see here. So that's it. I've been using this plugin for making sure that I had a flat response, and whenever I was here, I would simulate with other headphones or speakers to make sure that this translates well. So this would be flat, simulate a headphone that actually enhances the low end. Still acceptable. Same thing with speakers that enhance the low end. It's the Yamahas. And making sure that that you can still hear everything. And that's it. And now we would export. We would get rid of this plugin, meaning we would bypass this plugin before exporting. That's something that you have to do every time you're using this plugin. Whenever you export, make sure to bypass this plugin.